Ke roto mātou I te nehe ki Waipōuri. Te awa o Waipōuri e nei ki ngā roto o Waihora, o Waipōuri, I tōna wā hoki ko te roto o Tatawai. Ko e rā wai, rere atu nei, ka tūhono, ka hui ake ki ngā wai o te awa o Taiari. Te nuinga o ngā rākau I konei, ngā rākau pakeke, ngā rākau nui, he matai, he miro, e rā momo, he oti, he maha ngā rākau tāwai, ki roto I tēnei ngahere. Hoi anō, he tino tāonga, ngā ngahere pēnei, tēnei ngahere, te mea, I ora ake, ākoa ngā ahi o te Pākehā, ākoa ngā kani, hei te tūtonu, ko te ngahere nei e pupuri I te one, I te paruparu, no runga I ngā puke, I te wā I tahuna ngāhi, I topea ngā rākau, karekau he mea ki te pupuri e rā one. Ka heke ngā roimata o rangi nui, ko ngā one, ko ngā paruparu, no runga I te whenua. Ka heke rā e rā mea katoa ki roto I te wai Māori. He ka whakakiki haere, ka whakaparuparu haere I ngā awa, I ngā roto. Ka tino raru ngā ika Māori I tērā. Me te āhua hoki o te wai Māori. No reira e waimari e tātou mo enei wāhi ngā here, I ora, ki hai tahuna, ki hai topea. Ngā rākau pērā I tēnei paua e tū nei, tēnei rākau matai. E pērā hoki nei a mātou, ngā uri, ngā morehu, e tū tonu, ahakoa ngā ahuatanga o te wā. E tino taonga enei ngahere, ko te wawata ia, kia whakarauora I enei morehu, I enei toenga ngahere kia aha, kia pai ake te āhua o ngā awa, o ngā roto. Ka pērā hoki ngā awa, ka ora ake te ngahere, ka ora ake te wai Māori. Ka hoki atu au ki ngā kōrero roto I a te ure wera, tērā whakatau ki nei, ko te wai te toto o te whenua, ko te whenua te toto o te tangata. Nā reira, te raru te whenua, ka raru te wai, ki te raru te whenua, ka raru te tangata. Nā reira, me tino tia ki tātou I te whenua, kia whai oranga te wai Māori, te iwi Māori, ngā iwi katoa. This is said to be one of the lakes that our tūpuna rā Kai Tahu carved out. The name Waihora, it talks about the kind of great expanse of water, and even in the name, from that you can get a sense of the abundance of this area, and it was quite a food basket for our people. Yeah, so Waihora, now known as Waihola. As we're working to restore the health of these lakes, we also want to be restoring our traditional names that have been a bit degraded over the years, but the changing times, changing attitudes, I think that, we'll be able to restore the name of this roto.
Our tūpuna who recorded these traditions and left these absolute jewels for us, they first recorded this in the Moiraki records in 1880 as Waihora ki Taiari. I guess that's to distinguish it from the Waihora in Canterbury. That's an old name, one of the oldest names here. Waihora, pretty much wai, water, hora to spread out, was just an expanse of water. And that network of wetlands, rivers and tributaries right from Waihora right up into Mosgiel. So this whole area was a huge wetlands complex teeming with life and kai. There's rich layers of human occupation and history in here from those earlier times with Rā Kai Tahu and the Waitaha traditions to our Māmoe people at the mouth of the river, but along the river as well are various kaika or villages or pā, right up through to Mosgiel.
And they were here for hundreds of years on their own, populated, established the Mahika Kai pattern of living, utilising the land, moving around in the season, following the seasons, getting to know, searching, exploring every nook and cranny of the island.
So we're in the Waipōuri River, which is the Taieri River going down the Taieri mouth, but no, this is the Waipōuri, which goes to our left, and that's the Taieri River there, that goes to your right. From here, you'll see embankments, flood embankments, that were put in here by dredge buckets. It was all channeled and pretty well altered the whole landscape of the Taieri Plains. What you'll see in here in the wetlands is remnants of what pretty well the whole Taieri Plains was like. Once the Europeans moved in and started heavily farming, they pretty well drained all the plains.
The first Europeans to actually see the Taieri Plain immediately recognized the value of the soils, that this was going to be an area of great fertility and great food production. There were a lot of changes that happened, not just drainage and clearing of forest, but a lot of gold mining activities in this catchment, the Waipōuri River, which created a lot of sediment in the water that flowed down into these lakes. So these lakes and wetlands started to fill up with sediment much more rapidly than they had previously. We could work out that the rate of infilling of these lakes had increased about 30-fold after European arrival compared to before European arrivals. But when Europeans arrived and started to change the landscape massively, that created a lot of soil erosion, which we picked up in the middle of Lake Waihola as a big change in the character of the sediment there, and also the rate of infilling that we calculated.
Don't put your hands in the water here, because this is the outfall for the Waihola sewerage scheme. Right here, there's the sign, okay? So that's piped right back to just the base of the foothills there, and there's a old traditional sediment pond type sewerage system. So Waihola's houses discharge into that, and it settles in there. Then on an outgoing tide, they discharge into this channel. So now you'll know why I don't fish downstream of the outlet, because that's just totally against our beliefs and culture. I don't even know why people swim down and boat down by the Henley there, because when they discharge, you know that they're discharging. It's quite brown and murky and looks a bit gritty, and it flows on the outgoing tide. When the tide's coming in, it really pushes through here, so it potentially can get pushed back into the wetlands as well.
Most people wouldn't know that was there, would they?
No. It's a touchy subject locally, that. People go all kind of quiet.
This is the main drain. So every single farm on the plains here, all of their drains drain into this main drain. That flows down to here, down to the pumping station. It's behind me here, and it actually gets pumped uphill into Lake Waipōuri. So all of the runoff from the farms, fertiliser, the raw animal waste, pesticides, herbicides, all accumulates into this drain, and it's being pumped right into our wetlands, where a lot of our whānau used to come and gather kai.
Te Nohoaka Tukiauau is a tribal property that we received back in the late 90s through that Kāi Tahu Claim Settlement Act. Part of that redress, cultural redress, was really in compensation for the loss of our mahika kai, our wāhi mahika kai, the drainage of significant food baskets here on the Taiari, the Lake Tatawai. So really this property here was received as redress for those grievances in the late 90s through that Ngāi Tahu Claim Settlement Act.
My father, as a youngster, would go and stay with his uncle and auntie at the Henley Kaik before World War One, and go fishing with his uncle on Lake Tatawai. And he used to talk about this, or if we were out there as youngsters, he would talk about this Lake Tatawai, which had disappeared. And so I talked to him about that in terms of preparing for the Waitangi Tribunal, my father, and yes, went and visited Lake Tatawai, found it, and it's just like a big fishbowl, but dry. You could walk on it with your slippers, bone dry.
The whānau that were living out here at the kaik at Henley, Maitāpapa is the traditional name there. This was our estate, our backyard. Our people would come here to harvest kai, tuna, waterfowl, pūtakitaki.
It was a key resource for the Henley kaika. That's what they relied on. Their access to other places had been diminished because of private, landholders and farming and ditching and drainage and what have you. And so Tatawai was their food basket. Anyway, what happened? There was a law passed unbeknown to the community out there. They missed the notice in the paper. And before they knew it, there was a law passed to allow the Taieri River Trust, I think it was, to drain Lake Tatawai. And so it was duly drained in the 20s, and that community was pretty well dissipated by the 1930s. My father's uncle and auntie moved to Tuahiwi, north of Christchurch. Other whānau who were associated with that kaik just disappeared into the community to survive.
For whānau that were living here, they were being shut out of their traditional food gathering places, and so they petitioned to have a reserve set aside so that they could continue that unbroken intergenerational practice of gathering those foods that were important to them. So there were a series of acts that just saw those decisions being overturned, the priority being agricultural practices here for European farmers.
Yeah, the Henley Kaik was sort of a hub for the local hapu because it was such a strategic site because the availability of mahinga kai all around us here, and then the highway out to the sea from the Taieri River. There was something like 40, 50 head of population, tangata whenua that lived here, and there was quite a big hall built. I've seen pictures of the opening. There was prominent Maori from the whole wider area came to the opening, and it was a huge occasion, so opening this hall, but sadly it opened and then virtually closed within 10 years because of just the depopulation of the kaika. Various drainage bodies that controlled the drainage of the Taieri plain put in a flood protection scheme that meant that instead of being on a flood plain, it was part of the flood channel where they concentrated the flood waters, so any flood that came would be much more severe. The depth of water would be huge compared with what it was before the flood protection scheme went in. So that was one thing. And then the actual Taieri plain got drained, and there was several Mahika Kai sites, the Lake Tatawai, Lake Ascog, they all got drained as well. So the Mahika Kai availability decreased dramatically.
Besides Lake Tatawai, less than 10% of our wetlands survived here in Otago. So massive impact on our customary ways, customary resources, the ability to access these places and live that way, retain mātauranga and pass on that knowledge, and retain the capacity and strength to be the right type of kaitiaki to these resources through drawing on your knowledge handed down over generations of these places.
Manuscripts that were written down by our kaumātua kind of in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's not to say that our oral traditions haven't survived, but a lot of the mātauranga was recorded, and a lot of the things that I learned about this place have come from the writings and collections of our ancestors who were alive at the time that this place was in abundance. And one of the challenges for our people was most of them are all written in our native tongue. Ki roto i te reo tūturu o Kāi Tahu, te mita o Kāi Tahu, my generation who have been taught te reo Māori, and our parents who have been the ones to relearn te reo Māori, that are now starting to unlock some of those hidden gems and kōrero that our tupuna left for us so that we can share it to the rest of our hapu and to the rest of our iwi. Through those stories, we learn about our connection to our places.
How to find, how to utilise, how to cook, how to preserve, even the cycles, the breeding patterns. All of those things are important to understand how a particular fish, bird or plant, that resource is sustainably managed. It's got to be passed on. It's got to be learned from elders. It's a knowledge, it's a bit like a language. If you don't use it for a generation, you can lose it. And so your role as kaitiaki is quite tied to actually knowing how to use a resource, when to use it, when not to, and how to go about protecting it from inappropriate activity or use. So all of those things couple with the role of being a kaitiaki.
A lot of our people, especially the generations above me, weren't in that position to inherit some of those kōrero, some of that mātauraka, particularly around our mahika kai, as we've had quite a massive loss of our repo, of our mahika kai out here, and with that loss of knowledge comes the loss of that intergenerational memory and association with the place. It's up to my generation to bring that intergenerational connection back through our stories, through our language, and through our traditional practices. We often envision our wetlands as open, spaced, empty, or from a Western perspective anyway, but just even our perception of what is a wetlands, what is a lake, what is a river. I want for our future generations for that perception that it's a swamp, it's a dirty place, you don't go there, but for us it's was our food basket, it was the materials that we gathered for our clothing, the raupo. It's quite a buoyant plant, and they were woven to create what we call our mōkihi, or a raupo canoe, yeah. So from what I've learnt anyway, the flat part is called the rau, the raupo, and this white part in the middle, this is called the puka. You can actually eat this part. You can eat the centre of it. I'm gonna risk it today. Almost has a like a cucumbery sort of. Texture of a lettuce. But a bit slimy, eh?
Not bad. Full of nutrients, eh?
It's delicious. You get a pretty good feed out of a small patch like this. We've managed to propagate some raupo seeds in our nursery actually, and we're hoping to get it established in some of our shallower kind of ponds. The root systems of the raupo provide habitat for microorganisms that help to break down organic matter at a much faster rate than just sitting in the water. Yeah. So
They like high nutrient water too, don't they?
They're really good at filtering and cleaning our waterways out. They're also, raupo is quite a culturally important plant to us here. Used to be a food source. I probably wouldn't eat them. Yeah. Probably wouldn't eat it today, as absorbing all those nutrients and runoff from the farms. Yeah, but it was quite a highly valued food source.
One of the things that the first Europeans to arrive wrote about was that up near Mosgiel on the Taieri Plain, there was still some kahikatea bush. Kahikatea is a really valuable timber, and Europeans quickly found that out, and the forest only lasted 5 or 10 years after the settlement of the area by Europeans, and it was cut down. Kahikatea pollen turned out to be a really useful indicator pollen for that time period when Europeans arrived. We could look in the sediments and count the kahikatea pollen grains, and we could see at a point in time they went from being very abundant to being almost not there. We could interpret that as being the time around the 1850s when Europeans had really cut down the last kahikatea bush. I don't know if you've ever seen kahikatea pollen, but that's what it looks like. It's about 60 microns or something like that. Here's the pollen diagram. So you can see that it was abundant and then it just flatlines.
A little bit of a peak there.
Yeah, there's a little bit coming in. Yeah, I don't know.
Somewhere.
Or maybe it's been blown from further. I don't know.
Interesting here, this big drop, and then it spikes up again.
It's quite variable further down. Yeah.
If that lines up with some of the tidal influences.
Possibly, yeah. And yeah, I think one of the real utilities of doing this kind of work is if you're interested in restoring lakes and wetlands, because this is how you can figure out what the reference condition is. And then once you know that, that might end up being your target for restoration.
A lot of our place names will give kind of a brief description of what that area, the resources in the area, and it actually matches up with some of the pollen samples and some of the other kind of organic matter that's been found in these cores, which is pretty interesting to us. We actually want to get a core sample done in here, and these kind of ponds would be awesome to do that. But there's a place called Te Waihora out on this side, and some of the pollen samples that were picked up miro as well. So it would be interesting to see if the place names that include certain tree species in the area, if there was a core sample done, would that tree species be more abundant? Or
Throughout the wetlands, which is the breeding ground or spawning ground for the whitebait, no whitebaits. They used to scoop the whitebait out of here by the bucketful. And you can imagine when the Taieri Plains was like the wetlands that we'd just been through. That's a vast area. The amount of native fish in there would have been phenomenal compared to the introduced fish. So the whitebait was aplenty. There's still quite a bit of whitebait comes in here, but not like it used to. And it's definitely under threat from the loss of wetland areas, and also that glyceria, again, that's destroying the natural native grasses where the whitebait spawn.
We're here on the banks of the Taiari River, Te Awa o Taiari. We're going to be checking out one of the last remnants of kind of lowlands, wetlands forest that we'd like to be restoring out on the rest of the Taiari wetland system. It's probably some of the last remaining kahikatea. Ki muri nei au, e tahi rākau kahika te ara nei. Koe nei te tahi o ngā tino rākau e tipu nei ki roto i ngā repo, ki ngā tahataha o ngā roto, ngā awa, i rā momo mea. Ki tātou nei o Ōtākou, he tino mahika kai, ngā hua o te kahikatea. Ko te kahikatea hoki te tahi o ngā rākau e whakamomona ai te kereru. Hoi anō i nāianei, kua tino ngaro haere te kahikatea i roto i o mātou repo nei ki Waihora, ki Waipōuri, te riu o Taiari. Nō reira, koe nei te tehi o ngā tino rākau piringi ana mātou ki te whakahoki, ki runga i tō mātou whenua. Ki tēnei takiwā, he maha hoki ngā kōrero e pāna ki tēnei rākau. Te tehi o ngā whakatauki e ki nei, ko te kahikatea tūtahi he kai mā te hau. He uru kahika ki te wao, he uru tangata ki te pā. Tērā te tipu o te kahikatea, ahakoa tana teitei, tino pakupaku hariti mea, tino hohonu tana ngā toro o ngā pakiaka ki te whenua. Nō reira, ko te kahikatea tūtahi, mā manoa, mā te hau e puhi atu. Hoi anō, mena ka tipu ngā rākau, hei uru, ka tūhonohono, ka here tahi ngā pakiaka o te kahikatea, e kore rawa te hau e puhi aia, e kore rawa rātau e tūhei kai mo te hau. Nō reira, he tino rākau rangatira tēnei kia mātou, ko te kahikatea hoki, te tehi o ngā rākau teitei rawa i roto i tō tātou ngahere.